Napoleon Bonaparte is considered to be one of the most influential figures in history. He was a military and political leader of France who rose to power during the French Revolution. Napoleon led several successful campaigns during the French Revolutionary Wars, resulting in many treaties and territories being brought under French control. He became Emperor of the French in 1804 and transformed France into one of the most powerful nations on earth. Napoleon is seen by many as the most famous man of the 19th century, and during his time he controlled more of Europe than anyone since the great Romans at their height. One way he accomplished this was he was an amazing military strategist and is often credited with the invention of the modern system of warfare. He was a military genius and had a way with words that helped him to motivate his troops. He also had a knack for using propaganda as a weapon of war, both to inspire his own men to fight harder and demoralize his enemies before they even fought. Napoleon is credited with many military victories, including at Austerlitz in 1805, Jena in 1806, Friedland in 1807, Wagram in 1809, and the list goes on. Napoleon's military success, especially in Europe, led him to believe that he could now become the new Alexander, and by 1812, Napoleon had started wars with almost every country on the continent, and was attempting to conquer lands all the way from Britain to Russia. Seeing all of this, the leading European powers of the time, scared by Napoleon's military might, all banded together and declared war on France. After many years of fighting in 1814, a coalition of Prussian, Austrian, Swedish and Russian troops defeated the French army and took Paris. Forced to abdicate, Napoleon was exiled to the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba as a condition of the Treaty of Fontainebleau. Napoleon's time at Elba is a topic that has been studied by many historians, but the most well-known interpretation is that Napoleon was a prisoner who was allowed to roam freely on the island. The truth is that Napoleon's time at Elba was anything but free. He had to constantly be on his guard, and he could not set foot off the island without risking being captured. Still, most of his time during exile in Elba, Napoleon was thinking of how he could return to power. France had become a constitutional monarchy, and the unpopular Louis XVIII had been placed on the throne. Napoleon still harbored grandiose plans for his country's future and kept in constant contact with his associates in France, which was a relatively short distance away. Finally, on February 26, 1815, after 10 long months of exile, Napoleon escaped Elba with a handful of soldiers. They easily eluded the British Navy and quickly made it back to the mainland. On his decision to return from exile, Napoleon said,
"After making a mistake, or suffering a misfortune, the man of genius always gets back on his feet."
Once back in France, Napoleon gathered troops on his way to Paris. 6 days after his arrival, he was confronted by a garrison of soldiers that had been sent for the express purpose of stopping him. Napoleon faced the soldiers alone and offered the chance to kill him to anyone who would take it. Instead of taking the offer, they cheered and shouted his name, signaling their allegiance. They cheered on,
"Long live the Emperor!"
With the army now behind him, Napoleon quickly retook control of France. The news quickly spread across the globe, and the European powers of Great Britain, Prussia, Austria and Russia, who were at each other's throats prior to Napoleon's return, quickly reunited. They declared Napoleon an outlaw and quickly started marching to war. What preceded was the Battle of Waterloo, often regarded as one of history's most decisive battles, which decided the political fate not only for France, but also for all of Europe. The battle lasted several hours, and in the end Napoleon's army was defeated by a coalition led by the Duke of Wellington and Prussian Field Marshal Blucher. Wellington's army consisted of British and Dutch troops, with some Belgian, German and Swiss units, while Blucher's army was made up of mainly Prussian troops. The battle brought an end to 23 years of conflict, totally removed France's dominance and destroyed Napoleon's empire forever. But the quick rise to power and then the crushing defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo is well documented and widely discussed. But what is often overlooked is what happened to Napoleon after his defeat at Waterloo. You see, after the battle had been lost, Napoleon fled the battlefield, barely escaping being captured. He attempted trying to escape to America, but the ports had been blocked by British troops. He was soon captured, and for the second time he was forced into exile, this time on the island of St. Helena. St. Helena was chosen deliberately by the Allied forces. Napoleon had originally requested to be exiled in England, which was denied by the British government. Instead, they had chosen an extremely remote island from which they could be certain there would be no escape. After all, they did not want a repeat of Elba. They chose the island of St. Helena, which was so far away from the French mainland that it took a ship carrying Napoleon 3 months just to reach the island, finally arriving in October 1815. St. Helena, which is situated in the mid-Atlantic, is an astonishing 1,200 miles away from the nearest landmass. Once the ship had docked on the island, Bonaparte asked to delay disembarking until nightfall in order to avoid attracting the attention of the watching local inhabitants. Their gaze was probably due to their awareness that he had been responsible for war and creating dread all throughout Europe over the last 20 years, so they were naturally intrigued. Surprisingly, because of the isolation of the island and its unique location, the inhabitants of St. Helena, then numbering around 5,000 people, including over 1,000 slaves, had not heard of Napoleon's escape from Elba, let alone the Battle of Waterloo, until only a few days before. The news came via ferret ships that were traveling with Napoleon's vessel, which had arrived a few days prior. Napoleon was not alone in exile, as 20 people followed him into exile, including some of his former servants and house aides. Once Napoleon finally stepped foot on the island, he shortly stayed in a family house known as the Briars. On 10th of December 1815, he was to move into his final residence, the Longwood Estate, a property said to have been particularly cold, uninviting, and infested with rats. Longwood sits on the top of a hill, which has the worst climate of the island. Most of the year it is extremely damp and gloomy, something Napoleon often complained about. Sir Hudson Lowe was appointed governor of St. Helena during Napoleon's stay on the island. Lowe's primary duty was to keep Napoleon from escaping while also supplying him with provisions. Despite the fact that they only met 6 times, their relationship is documented to be hostile and adversarial. Their main gripe was that Lowe refused to address Napoleon as Emperor of France, which did not sit well with Napoleon. During his time on the island, the former emperor's days were organized around meals, horse riding, and dictating his memoirs to his companions. After spending a few months on the island, Napoleon had come to terms with his fate that there was no escaping the island. He knew he could no longer fight on the battlefield and instead turned his attention to fighting for his place in history. His memoirs and letters written during his time in exile have helped reimagine his image to modern audiences. Many now see Napoleon throughout the world as a true leader, someone who with will and ambition alone brought all of Europe to his knees. Far different from how the majority of the world saw him during his own time. Due to heavy British propaganda, Napoleon was seen as a power-hungry madman. English mothers would scare their children into obedience by claiming if they don't behave, Napoleon would come get them. All throughout Great Britain, he was referred to as the bony boogeyman. As time progressed, life on St. Helena, for a man who had ruled over an empire, gradually became depressing. Napoleon was only allowed to walk freely within a limited area and under the supervision of several British soldiers. His house was watched day and night. Even his letters were opened before he could read them. Over the years, Napoleon shut himself away in Longwood, refused visits, and spent more and more time alone in his room. Napoleon's health began to deteriorate in July of 1820. The emperor rarely went out and spent lengthy hours in his bath to relieve his liver problems. According to his personal surgeon, he slept more than 12 hours a day and hardly left his bed. He forced himself to go for a walk on occasions, but would quickly become fatigued. Finally, after 5 long years on St. Helena, Napoleon died of stomach cancer on May 5th of 1821. He was still only 51 years old when he died. Napoleon's Grand Marshal, General Henry Bertrand, did hear some last words early in the morning of May 5th as he recalled.
From 3 o'clock until 4:30 there were hiccups and stifled groans. Then afterwards he moaned and yawned. He appeared to be in great pain. He uttered several words which could not be distinguished, and then the emperor said, "Who retreats at the head of the army?"
4 days later, he was buried in St. Helena in a location he himself had picked out, bringing an end to the life of the most famous man of the 19th century. Someone who leaves behind a complex legacy, yet no one can deny his impact on history and how he has shaped the world as we know it. Did you know Napoleon's house on St. Helena has been very well preserved and is a tourist attraction which brings many visitors to the remote island? You can even go see his original burial site. His remains were later removed from St. Helena and brought back to France. If you liked watching this video, please consider subscribing, as it would help me make more videos like this. Thank you.